Welcome to Stoa Conversations. My name is Michael Trombley,
And I'm Caleb Ontiveros.
and today we're doing a book review, but it's a philosophical book review. So we're talking about Plato of Athens: A Life in Philosophy, which is a new biography of Plato by Robin Waterfield. For those that don't know who that is, Robin is a prolific and I think quite excellent translator. He's translated a number of Greek works, including a number of Stoics. He has new editions of Marcus Aurelius and Epictetus available, both of which have notes and commentary. And so this is a biography of Plato, but in many ways, it's also an exploration of his ideas and the connection between Plato's thinking and his own life. We'll get into this in the episode, but Robin does a really good job saying what we know about Plato's life with certainty and making it clear where there's maybe myths or exaggerations. But at the end of the day, we don't have beat by beat portrayal of Plato's life here. We've got some key events, we've got some historical context, but I think the real value of this book is how it connects those things we do know and the context we do understand with Plato's thinking. And I think actually, I really enjoyed this book. Interested in what you think, Caleb, as we talk about it. But it helped me understand Plato as a person, kind of bring Plato back down to earth. Because with someone like him or Socrates, you think of them as these kind of mythical people that couldn't possibly be real, couldn't have been born or been the kind of person you could have attended a lecture of, and kind of grounds them in the real, which I really liked. And yeah, does a great job of breaking down how Plato's life informed his philosophy, which we'll get into. Anything to add before we jump into it?
Yeah, I really enjoy Waterfield's annotated translation of the Meditations. It's really nice to go through his version of the Meditations and go to the footnotes, and there he'll provide lots of useful context. And in a way, I thought about this book takes almost a similar approach where he describes the context of Plato's life, what's going on during these different periods of Plato's life, while also discussing his ideas, his works, and then also includes some sort of thorough detours about what's the which of Plato's works are legitimately works by Plato, and this sorts of thing, and what's the actual amount of what kind of reliable evidence do we have about events in his life. So I think that's really useful if you're sort of expecting biography in a sense of some epic story of Plato's life. Then I think this is not that book, but it could pair nicely with that book, which I'm not sure if it exists. Writing an actual biography of Plato is a daunting task. So I don't know if there are any good epic biographies of his life, but I think this is a good one in the same sense. It's nice to understand the context of Plato's life, and I think there are a number of things I learned about that context, about some specific detours Waterfield takes as well. So I generally enjoyed it.
I mean, when you were saying that, Caleb, I was thinking Plato's not really well known either for having an epic life. It's almost, he had epic thoughts, epic ideas. And so this is almost, an overview of those epic ideas and how the life informed those. As you said, it's a daunting task, I think, just because we don't have the evidence to support it. And you could probably do something in further detail if you had the evidence, but it really was, he's a great thinker. And so I like that we get into the thinking here. And I like that I enjoyed how he made those connections to, Plato's thought. So the way I'm going to break up this episode is I'm going to do 3 sections. We'll do Plato's early life, his middle period, his middle age, and then his later life. And I'll start with an overview of Plato's life during that time, so what he was doing in his early, middle, and late periods, and then connect that to the thinking or the writing or the ideas that he was presenting and talking about at those times, and try to make those connections or summarize those connections that Waterfield skillfully made. This is partly review, partly summary. I think it's going to lean on the side of summary, but I think, a review of a book like this, if it can make us think interesting things and it can make me come away with some interesting themes, then it's a good book. So I'm going to dig into the themes that it made me think and the thoughts that it left me with. And, if they did strike me as interesting, and hopefully they strike the listeners as the same way, as being interesting. And if so, then I think it's a good book. I think it's a good way to review it.
Maybe one way to frame it is, what can you expect to get out of this podcast if you listen to it is, first, of course, a basic understanding of Plato's life, but we'll be trying to set that context, trying to paint a richer picture of who he was and how that pertains to his philosophy, and of course the philosophies that came after, like Stoicism. So maybe that's a useful framing.
Mm-hmm. Great. Let's jump into it.
Let's do it.
Okay, so in terms of Plato's early life, so Plato was born between 428 and 423 BC in Athens to a rich aristocratic family. That's something that Waterfield does a good job explaining, is that, look, in order to have the leisure time to dedicate yourself to reading, writing, philosophy, almost all of these people were pretty well established, pretty powerful, had that kind of leisure time available to them. At the time of his birth, Socrates would have been in his 40s, and Athens would have been one of the most powerful and prosperous city-states in Greece. So born into this really successful, dynamic Athenian environment. But Plato's childhood was also a time of significant change. In 404 BC, when Plato would have been in his early 20s, Athens lost the Peloponnesian War to Sparta. So Sparta defeated them in the war, and Sparta set up a coalition of powerful Athenians that were sympathetic to Sparta to rule over Athens after the Spartans left. So they set up this coalition, and then the Spartans left, and they were like, you're going to rule in our place. You're going to maintain control for us. And this coalition was the 30 Tyrants, which included Plato's uncle, Charmides, and Critias, his first cousin once removed. Critias was even one of the leaders of the 30. So you can see there also the group of elites was rather small. Plato's one of these elites. They're picking from these elite and powerful to set up this coalition of the 30. And Plato has two immediate family members in just that 30 people, let alone the people working with them or collaborating with them. The 30 maintained power for only 8 months, but it was a really terrible time. They killed 5% of Athens' population, and they're known for confiscating wealth, so killing people and taking their possessions. The Athenians fought back, revolted against them, and they were overthrown, and that's why they had such a short rule. So in some ways, which is something that Waterfield points out, the hatred for the 30 was held against Socrates and may have contributed to his execution. Socrates had been the tutor of Critias and was considered to be closely associated with him. So Socrates was seen as being sympathetic or involved with the 30. And so there's this, often when we talk about the Apology, we read it in kind of a philosophical sense where Socrates is pursuing truth and people don't like the pursuit of truth. But that's the story that Plato's presenting there. But then there's also this historical reading where there's the overthrow of the 30, and then Socrates is kind of, his association with them is held against him. This can also be a kind of a radicalizing moment for Plato in a way. So Plato, in a very short period of time, you think he's a relatively young man, he's in his early 20s, old enough to understand what's going on, not old enough to be powerful or influential in these situations. He sees both tyranny in the form of the 30, involving some of his immediate family members. He sees the overthrow of that tyranny by democracy, but then he also sees the consequences of democracy in the execution of Socrates by basically popular vote, right? Socrates gets, he's convicted, and when you're convicted, that goes to a jury, a very large jury, I believe of 100 Athenian citizens. And so in that way, you've got this kind of popular vote against the life of Socrates. So after the death of Socrates, these formative moments in Plato's youth. He ends up traveling quite a bit. He went to Megara in Western Greece to study with Euclid of Megara. He returned to Athens around 394 BC to serve in the military for a year and fought in the Corinthian War. He traveled to southern Italy to study with the Pythagoreans. He visited Syracuse, which was under the rule of a tyrant, Dionysus. He took on Dion, the brother-in-law of the tyrant, as a pupil. And then around the age of 40, he returns to Athens and forms the academy, where he'll do his most substantial writing and teaching that we associate with him today. So what are the kind of philosophical insights or thoughts from his early life? Well, the first and probably most important is that what I already touched on is that Plato grew up in this time of political unrest where he saw both the limitations of tyranny in the 30 and the mob mentality of democracy in the execution of Socrates. And so Plato, there's this historical biographical reading of Plato where he becomes actually very interested in what constitutes a good ruler, very interested in what constitutes effective governance of the state. And that theme is explored really in the Republic, which we'll get to later, but that plants this seed in Plato of, okay, what role really does philosophy play? And how do we find something better than democracy and tyranny, which both have these major issues? So there's often this fun fact where it's like Plato thinks that democracy is almost as bad as tyranny, or at least he argues that in the Republic. But you think about it in the context of this, where tyranny is the rule of the one, but then democracy is just the whims of the many. There wasn't really here. It's not necessarily any better. And I mean, we see this kind of with internet culture, cancel culture, call it what you want, but there's not necessarily this value to just because a lot of people think it at the same time. It's not necessarily right or helpful. And that's what Plato, I think, is attuned to here. Another idea, which I already hit on, was this ability to do philosophy being so tied to wealth. I just think we're really lucky to have access to the resources we have today. Caleb, we don't even live in the same city, and we get to talk about philosophy every week on this podcast. I don't have to travel somewhere and go to a school, let alone be one of the people that can afford to travel somewhere. There's just so much access to books, even the ability to read. You can go over anything, but just like anybody can do philosophy now. It's so accessible. I'm very grateful for that. And it's not something for just the 1%. And then another interesting thing, unrelated to those previous two, is that Waterfield discussed the Sophists charitably. I didn't get into that biography in the biography, but the Sophists were this maybe intellectuals. I mean, Sophos means wise. So this intellectual group in Athens around the same time as Socrates and Plato. And Plato mocks them because they're the people who teach skills for money. So they'll teach you how to be a good orator, how to be a good at rhetoric, how to convince people of things. Like they were somebody you could pay to basically do this kind of intellectual work, either to teach you or to do it for you. And Waterfield, I thought, made this insightful analogy that you can kind of think of them almost like a college, like they're people who taught practical skills for money. It was valuable to learn how to write compelling speeches back in the time. It was valuable to learn how to, be convincing in your arguments, how to speak well. And so Plato often fights against them or disparages them as being not in pursuit of truth. And that's true in one sense, but I don't know, maybe I gave them a bit of a bad rap. That was another thing I was thinking. So that's a lot. That's Plato's early life. What did you think, Caleb?
Yeah, that's interesting, especially on the Sophists. There's, Waterfield points out that there's a number of them. They are different. Some were more philosophically sophisticated. Others, perhaps you could think of almost as teaching life hacks or something like this. But there is that also that point that you bring out, that Athenian society incentivized being good at rhetoric and in some sense being a talented intellectual, because it was a democracy and there was value in being able to convince your fellow citizens of a given thing. And I think that's certainly important. And there's I think Waterfield, as you say, does point out that probably the most influential, sort of formative influences on Plato is, of course, Socrates, being a student of Socrates. But then those two events, the rule of the 30 tyrants, and then 5 years, I think it's about 5 years later, the execution
Mm-hmm.
of Socrates, which does set up also that dichotomy between tyranny and democracy. And it is worth thinking about that. If you think about the different forms of government, really the word democracy tended to be describe the bad form of rule of the many throughout most of history. And if you think about Aristotle, who of course came after Plato, but Aristotle saw democracy essentially as the bad form of rule of the many, where a republic was, the much better form, the idealized version. And then you have, ruled by the one. The bad form of that's tyranny. The better form is monarchy, ruled by, an excellent ruler, and so on. So that's, I think that's maybe also some useful context here.
I mean, yeah, the context there, as I'm understanding, is just when we think of the criticism of democracy, we think of it in an Athenian context, which is the votings were restricted to a subsection of people, citizens. They had a certain degree of power, so it was already restricted to a subgroup. And then there was not, there was often these. I'm not an expert in Athenian democracy, but I know there was these wide-ranging votes. So you almost end up in this kind of like survivor situation often, where very serious situations come down to your ability to kind of um, make deals or convince people through speeches, as you said, instead of any sort of pre-established rule of law. I mean, we just know people are, besides being ignorant, people are petty as well and flawed in all the many different ways people are petty. And so when we're talking about democracy, um, we're not talking, we are talking about that in the Athenian context.
Well, yeah, and I think, I mean, historically, people might think democracy, at least as it's spoken about in the modern context, is probably worse than the Athenian one. But just because there are more people, I mean, historically, I don't think people objected to Athenian democracy because it was so restricted. It would be the second bit you point out, that it's a bad form. It's bad for making decisions. It's ruled by the mob essentially, and you have the Athenians deciding to go do these terrible things when Plato's much younger. There's an expedition to Syracuse that, on reflection, was pretty stupid, and then of course there's the killing of Socrates, essentially for not especially good reasons. It's a sort of idea that the mob can be controlled by either its own madness, its own logic, or it can be captured by demagogues. And perhaps that's how it's related to this, the classic criticism of the Sophists, that, the Sophist isn't focused on truth. Really, they're focused on rhetoric in an art of itself. And that turns out to be, what can you do? What can you say
Yeah.
to wield power over the mob and so on?
Well, maybe to bring into a Stoic context, the sophist is interested, has dedicated their life to an indifferent
Yeah,
of
that's a
this
great way to put it.
rhetoric, and the Platonic ideal is to dedicate your life to the good, to virtue, and then as a virtuous person, you then rule. Where the sophist is, says, I'm pursuing ruling or persuasion. If I get that, being a good person or a bad person, what does that matter? Yeah, great points. So moving to the next phase in Plato's life, I mean that already was like, wow, this is really interesting. One thing we don't do in philosophy, or not when you're trained as a philosopher, is you don't really think biographically. It's not really part of the training that I received. You do a bit in classics, but in philosophy, it's not really a biographical interest. It's like it's really is the history of ideas, not a history of people. So already that thinking of Plato as being inspired by those conditions was interesting for me, insightful. But when we get to the Middle Academy, so I'll talk about those years next. So in 383 BC, so we think about Plato as being, in his early 40s. His focus is on developing the academy. And so this is a period of time where he teaches many students, including Aristotle, who arrives in 367. And Waterfield discusses what the academy would have been like. So students would congregate, they would eat together, they would debate, they would argue, they would listen to lectures. It was a proper school for philosophy. It was a period of time when Waterfield describes it as a research academy, a place that encouraged disagreement and debate. It was not a place for a blind adherence to theory. And so I think sometimes there can be this reading of Aristotle as like Aristotle leaves Plato and then goes, and it's so he must not like Plato because he criticizes him, or he talks about why Plato's wrong, or he goes against the theory of the forms. And another way of reading this is that Plato was actually, he was inculcating in here a real research mindset, a pursuit of the truth, and it wouldn't have been seen necessarily as a bad thing that Aristotle deviated, or that other people kind of had their own nuances to the theory, or different ways of approaching it. I thought that was cool. It's not a place where you go and Plato lectures at you and you are trying to understand the thought of Plato. It's still very much being formed, being debated, and being constructed. So this is also where Plato writes his middle dialogues. This introduces his thinking above and beyond Socrates. So the Republic and the Symposium, for example, are from this period. And I think there are two key connections between Plato's thinking and his philosophy that I want to call out. First, people often frame Plato as having a early, middle, and later period. The early period is Socratic in his writing. It ends in confusion. You think of this like the Euthyphro. There's no real answer. They say, what is justice? What is piety? They don't get to an answer. The middle period introduces Plato's ideas, but retains the influence of Socrates. It's the Republic. Socrates is there. He's a character. There's debate, but there's a right answer. And the later period becomes very prescriptive. That's like Plato's laws. Maybe Socrates is in the book, the dialogue, maybe he's not. And then it's often very monologue-y. We can graph these periods then onto Plato's life. At first, he's developing his thinking. He's really influenced by his interactions with Socrates. He's a young man. He's wanting to share what he's learned from Socrates, which is the Socratic method. Then he returns and he establishes the academy in the middle period. And he's the successful and established writer, but he's not the head of a school that wants to just pontificate. He's someone still developing his thought. He's the leader of this research academy. And so he's getting more prescriptive in his writing, which I think is cool. And then Waterfield also, besides that idea, Waterfield also frames Plato's Republic, which is thought to be his best work, as a response to Plato's childhood. Plato wants to answer the question of good government. He rejects democracy and tyranny. And in the Republic, he argues for an enlightened rule by a philosopher. We also have a connection to Marcus Aurelius here, who for many was considered the closest we got to that ideal. So we've done some discussions on Plato's thought. Republic, I think, an amazing book. I'd recommend anybody here to read it, although can be a bit dense. I read it chapter by chapter over the course of a seminar in graduate school, which was really the right way to do it. You read 30 pages and you go talk about it. Recognizing that everyone has that opportunity. But Plato puts forward in that this conception of the philosopher king, which is like, what's the best way to rule? Well, it's somebody who rules in the pursuit of truth, somebody who leads and governs in pursuit of the good, who also actually understands the good, is wise, doesn't pursue the good and is mistaken. And often we think about Marcus Aurelius as maybe the closest we got to that, someone who had all the power, but actually genuinely tried to live in accordance with the good and was pretty wise, got pretty close at the same time. So that's an interesting connection to Stoicism. Anything on that period of time before we get into some other themes?
I think the mapping on, like if you're thinking about going through some of the Socratic dialogues, mapping on to the middle, early, or later period is certainly a useful thing to do. And I don't think, my impression from there is that Waterfield was generally in line with what most other
I think so.
philosophers and classics I had read on that question. So I think that is what most people tend to think, and his grouping of the relevant dialogues there can be useful. Probably one of the most interesting discussion elements of this for me was when he was talking about whether Plato had formed a proper school, and sort of juxtaposing Plato's academy against later Hellenistic schools, which do become more dogmatic. I would say the Stoics are an example of a school which became more dogmatic, in particular around in that classical sense, in terms of defining what they believe. This is what Stoicism is, and constraining the school in that way. Whereas Plato didn't have, there was no document that really wrote down, defined what it was to be a Platonist, and said his writings were much more open-ended in these forms of dialogues,
Mm-hmm.
which I do think sets him apart from Zeno and certainly Chrysippus, who helped define Stoic dogma, as it were. So I think that's and interest is certainly, it's something he left to his followers, perhaps, and perhaps there's something in that style, that dialogue heavy style, focus on conversation, that plays a part in the longevity of his work, really, and also push back against dramatizing early on, or push back against him being a dogmatic figure.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I'm not an expert on Neoplatonists, but Neoplatonist is that's a school of philosophy that came a while after Plato, looked to Plato as the source of truth and authority, and tried to interpret his writings. And yeah, you talked about the ambiguity as leading to the popularity of Plato's work. And I just think an example, Neoplatonists are not that popular. I don't know, which is this attempt to like dogmatize Plato, define Plato, say, no, this is 100% what he meant, where there's a lot of joy in reading Plato as, I mean, in a way, it's this two of the greatest thinkers. You get Socrates and Plato, the ambiguity of Socrates, and then the development of the thought. But people aren't that excited about, there's a reason people don't like the Laws, or some of Plato's later works are less popular than the earlier and the middle ones, which is what you're pointing to.
Yeah, and we'll talk more about the Laws. Waterfield thinks that's an essential part of Plato's canon, body of work, as it were. And you're right, that doesn't get as much attention as Plato's other works.
Great. So 3 other things that I thought reading this section about the middle of his life. First, there's this portion Waterfield talks about where Plato was cautious about writing because it was passive. So, but like Plato was cautious about consuming writing, engaging with written texts. But what Waterfield points out historically is that actually engaging with written text was listening to something being read aloud. People wouldn't sit down and read because there wouldn't be access to kind of a larger library. That wasn't the method of consumption. So Plato was actually worried when he talks about the passivity of writing. He was actually worried about listening. I thought that was an interesting point. And so it's this contrast between listening to content, consuming content, and then engaging in conversation. And I thought that I pointed out in my notes here, maybe this is similar to podcasts, and I'm not trying to say there's not a value to listening to podcasts. Obviously that's, we're doing this because we think there is one, but it's pointing out this type difference between listening and then actually being engaged in conversation. And, I listen to podcasts. I'm not trying to criticize people listening to this. I think it's a great tool, but Plato's pointing out, what is a step above this and better than listening or consuming is actually being in a philosophical environment, having those conversations. And that's something I think in our kind of like, I listen to a lot of podcasts. I watch a lot of YouTube. There's a lot of just consumption going on, and thinking about opportunities in my life to replace that with conversation. It's part of the reason why I enjoy this podcast so much, and why I tend to remember the stuff we talk about in this podcast and internalize it a lot better.
Yeah. Well, just to add on to that, I think this is also connected to the idea that's common across Greco-Roman philosophy, which is that happiness is an activity. Philosophy is an activity. It's not as much a state that you can download, as it were. So, a philosopher is someone who is just engaged in dialectic, right? Philosophical reasoning. Mm-hmm. And sometimes it's much more fun to consume, I suppose, but that's not what the philosopher aims at.
Yeah, You gotta get into more debates. Is what Plato's saying. You gotta be like Socrates. Got to bug people in the middle of the street. Ask them what they mean by the words they use. But I guess Socrates is a great example of that. Um, I was teasing a bit, but he's doing what Plato thinks we should be doing. Um, Another point here, Plato's just ripping into all of our hobbies. Plato criticized poetry as being an imitation of reality. This is a very famous argument in the Republic. You know, you think about the allegory of the cave. There's the representations of the world versus the world itself, and poetry is this world of representation, which takes us away from truth. It's this poor imitation. But Waterfield, again, with historical insight, points out that poetry was where dramatic stories were told. So this is not Plato criticizing, you know, lyrical poetry. This is him criticizing television or movies today. Right? He's criticizing, again, consumption, again, watching stories of heroism, watching stories of great people. I guess instead of going out and becoming that or doing that yourself or learning from engaging with real people, just cautioning what I mean, and this you can see as there's different ways to read Plato here, but there's this basic point I think about media literacy, right? Like questioning the stories, the themes, the ideas we're getting from the movies and TV we're watching, being cautious about it, recognizing that it's not reality but a representation, and that's different, which I thought was interesting. People don't normally talk about Plato as he's talking about television. They're more just like, he thinks poetry's bad.
Yeah, and there's that classic. Yeah, I think even Cicero has something to the effect of, Plato was a poet against all the poets, or something like this, some line like that, because Plato was a poet, and also he clearly was a excellent writer, artist, and I think that makes his targets certainly a little clearer. Maybe it's better not to think of it as poetry as we think about it, but more these epic stories or popular entertainments and such. But I would also add that in addition to, I think a non-Platonist could get on board with that and be like, yeah, of course stories distort reality in a certain way, but there is also that idea that the more, we could get into Platonic metaphysics, which can be a bit confusing, but if you think about what's ultimate reality for Plato, it's the forms and so on, these perfect purified versions of things, which a story is not. That's what a philosopher is trying to get at through through reasoning. So that's what they're attempting to know.
Well, is that something like, yeah, when we're trying, I mean, that maybe that goes back to the craft analogy. I'm thinking about this for the first time, but if you want to understand the craft of goodness, look to real people who have encountered real situations and navigated them well. Don't look to fictional characters. In some way, the fictional character is helpful. They're displaying something, but maybe you're not learning about the reality of virtue, that craft or that practice in the same way as, looking to a real person doing it. I think that's the case. I think always a real person is going to be a better displayer of the craft than a fictional character.
Yeah, that could be right. That could be right.
And so one other idea I had here was an interesting anecdote was that as a form of pedagogy, Plato would lay out all the work that was required to belong to the academy on the first day. Like students would rock up and he'd be like, if you want to be a philosopher, this is what it takes. You got to do all this. And his reasoning was that this would excite the proper students and discourage the bad ones. I think that's just a fun little story. I think about that when I tell people about PhDs. As being, should I do a PhD? And my advice is generally no. You should probably not. Probably not. And I generally think that, like, if someone is going to do well in a PhD, they have to be the kind of person that is. It doesn't make the advice wrong, but they have to not be discouraged by that kind of advice. I think there's something here to Plato's saying, which is, if you're there for the right reasons, this idea of reading and debating and doing all the things philosophers do is going to excite you, and that much work is going to discourage the people who aren't suited for it.
Yeah, I like this heuristic. I think it's a good filter. People, I think there's also that line with business, right? People ask, should I start a business? Should I be an entrepreneur? And, should I start a startup? As many people advise, just the default answer, no. And if you're the kind of person who's going to do it, then that won't dissuade you. But if you are thinking about, that sorts of negative feedback, and of course, maybe, the reality of starting a business, what have you, dissuades you from doing it, then perhaps that means it's not the path for you, which is fine. There are different paths, different roles, and so on, as the Stoics would say.
Yeah. So yeah, good little heuristic, as you said.
Yeah.
Um,
One other. Did you have anything else? But I did want to call out one other sort of theme that I took
no,
from.
please do.
Yeah. So one other theme. There's a nice section where Waterfield, I think, is sort of around here, where he talks through some of the basic ideas of Platonic philosophy, and he does call out that Platonic philosophy was, in a real sense, religious. We might even say spiritual, but he says Plato had come to hold the startling view that philosophy itself had a religious purpose, assimilation to God, and also calls out noted that there's these aspects of Platonic philosophy that have a lot in common with spiritual ideas. The immortality of the soul, this idea that the point of philosophy is to purify the soul, achieving a communion with God and breaking free of, this constant cycle of reincarnation. I think, Plato did believe in reincarnation. And I think that, these are important aspects of his thought. And sometimes I don't know if you've had this experience before, but I've been in philosophy type classes where people are teaching Plato and they sort of almost make him seem like a secular, rational, modern type person. Not exactly modern, but water down some of his metaphysics in a way. And I think it's important to remember both sort of the ambition that Plato had for philosophy, this idea of assimilation to God. I mean, what a mission, what a purpose for a craft. And also the fact that he did have these really religious views about the immortality of the soul, of course, and reincarnation and such.
Yeah, my philosophy grad school anecdote for that. I don't know if I have a I don't know if I had strong enough opinions about Plato to think that he was being watered down, or the religious aspects were being downplayed. But then when you read the Republic and you get to the end of it, and it's just, as you said, just full blown discussions of like reincarnation into animals, like selecting where your soul is going to go. And I was like, whoa, this is this is heavy. This is getting, as you said, pretty ambitious. And that training in philosophy as a preparation of our soul for death. It's almost funny how the Stoics, I'm taking it back to Stoicism, the Stoics don't believe in reincarnation. They don't believe in an afterlife. In some ways, everything's material. We have a piece of the universe within us. That piece of the universe moves and takes a different form. These are definitely Stoic ideas, but like your soul does not leave the body and remain in a unified state or has any sort of identity to it. And so when they talk about philosophy as a preparation for death, they almost take it like, well, death is a scary thing, and like it matters that you handle death well because it's impressive. Where Plato talked about, and certainly Socrates talked about philosophy as a preparation for death, because your soul would literally leave your body, and it would then be more exposed to the forms and the divine, and it would only be prepared to handle and deal with that and navigate that world successfully without the shackles of the body if you'd been practicing philosophy well. So yeah, just occurring to me now how that philosophy as a preparation for death means a much very different thing to Plato than it does for the Stoics, even though they both carry that Socratic idea forward.
Yeah, that's a good point. A similarity that's ultimately grounded in a difference, I suppose.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah, great ideas. So moving to the later life, this to me I thought the middle part was kind of boring. Not the book wasn't boring, but Plato's middle life is kind of boring because he just kind of sits and writes and does his hard thinking. He does philosophy, runs his school.
Yeah, it's more interesting to read about what he wrote than I suppose read about his life
Yeah.
at this point. Yeah.
And then in the later life, he goes and does some interesting things again, things I didn't realize he did. So after almost 20 years of teaching in the academy, Plato returns to Syracuse. So remember, he said at the start, he went to Syracuse. He tutored the Dion, who I believe was the brother-in-law of the tyrant. Um, yes, and so he's asked to return to Syracuse by Dion, his old student, to tutor the new tyrant Dionysius II, the child of the previous one. And Waterfield calls this section of the book idealism tempered, which is very direct in what he thinks is occurring here. So Plato attempts to convert this tyrant to philosophy and is unsuccessful. Dionysius II appreciates the cultural value of having great thinkers in his court. He really likes the cultural cachet of having the intellectual elite around, and he's happy to show off Plato, but he doesn't take on Plato as an actual mentor. He makes some progress, Plato. Dion, and Dionysius attempt to write a revised constitution for Syracuse. So Plato does have some influence, but Dionysius ultimately rejects the project. He banishes Dion from Syracuse in disgrace. Plato has to convince Dionysius to let him go. Rumors circulate that Plato's been killed by the tyrant. So things basically blow up. Plato has to ask to leave. His friend gets kicked out. And so Plato's project to produce a philosopher king fails. He returns to the academy and spends the rest of his life producing his later dialogues. Fitting with the theme of idealism tempered, Waterfield frames Plato's last work in the context of Plato's biography, Plato's life. Dialogues like Laws have much less Socratic conversation. They're more prescriptive and less about a hypothetical city or utopia. Plato in his later years and closer to his death, he turns much more to these grounded questions of how to actually rule and set up a country, and less to the ideal form of the hypothetical city-state. And so that's that idealism tempered. Forget about the Republic. How can I, as a philosopher, actually help tyrants, actually help rulers run better cities? And in a way, it's humbling, right? Plato, we don't have a step-by-step account here, but Plato doesn't achieve his project. He doesn't demonstrate the political smarts to navigate the situation well. He can't translate his idealistic thinking into prescriptions that will be executed. Yeah, and so for me, that's it's kind of interesting to think of old Plato, mature, already wrote the Republic Plato, caught up in this courtroom drama, caught up in the sphere of influence of a tyrant. And then I also couldn't help but think about the parallels with Seneca. Both Seneca and Plato spending their later years trying and arguably failing to give practical and moral advice to a tyrant. I don't see this connection made very often, if at all, but both of them, two great thinkers engaged in the same project unsuccessfully. Not sure what that tells us about philosophy. Maybe it just tells us something more about the nature of tyrants. Maybe they got further than other people would. I guess we'd need some counterexample of people who actually were successful with tyrants, if they even exist. But that's the later story. Is he builds up this theory, he builds up this thought. He says, "I'm going to put it into practice. I'm going to make some change," and he doesn't succeed. And so he turns with a bit more attention to these actual practical questions of how to rule an actual city.
Yeah, I think it's I think this is also another place where it's useful to read biography into the experience of or into one's interpretation of the later works. I think that's definitely correct, or very likely correct, I should say, as a non-expert, non-Plato scholar. And it's just a very interesting episode of history. We should maybe even cover this in later detail in another episode, but this idea of Plato attempting to reform, get Dionysius II interested in philosophy, especially understood as this practice of, cultivating oneself. Remember, it's this ambitious project, perfecting oneself, really, and doing so with his friend Dion, and ultimately failing. But also, there's all these political dynamics where there's Dion is banished, and Dionysus II, not without justification. So I think fears rebellion from Dion, and then even there's Dion himself eventually does overthrow Dionysus II, and then is assassinated by another pupil of Plato's, which I think is also perhaps, I think, another way in which Plato must have thought he failed, if his pupils went against each other, just like so. But I mean, you have philosophy trying to convert the tyrant into philosopher, and then also these sort of palace intrigues and such. So I think it's probably worth covering in more detail.
Yeah, we could do a play by play. It's like, where's my HBO miniseries? That's what I want to know. I need idealism tempered.
Yeah.
The Plato story.
Good episode title, perhaps.
I don't know if you're like, I just don't think of philosophers as the kind of people who like are teaching pupils and have their pupils, engaging in these philosophical or in these political intrigue. And they're like, no, don't do that. Or they're like really upset by it. I mean, yeah, I just think of this. This was helpful for me to ground Plato as a person, because I think of him just kind of like existing outside of time, because he's so prolific in his writing and his thinking. And yeah, I don't think this episode gets enough attention. For all the reasons you stated, it's really fascinating. We will do a longer episode on it. I think Waterfield, we actually have this one in pretty good detail because Plato writes about it in his letters. And so you get these non-philosophical writings of Plato, which I hadn't read before, basically describing what's going on in his life, what has occurred in these in this time in Syracuse. So very, very historically interesting episode.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think perhaps a reminder that philosophy is not merely theory, right? Perhaps it's not not as specialized, or I know there are modern philosophers, of course, who will say this sort of thing, and they aim to make it not as theoretical, but it's not isolated to the ivory tower and such. It's
Mm-hmm.
at least it aspires to something more concrete, political change. But perhaps this is a story where that's just exceptionally difficult to do, exceptionally difficult to make happen.
Yeah, I think about like when we typically criticize philosophy for being abstract, we criticize the ivory tower. We're thinking about that in something that's like inaccessible. It doesn't produce value. I mean, if philosophy has produced any value, Plato's right up there, top 3 in terms of, establishing the discipline, influencing other thinkers and other people later on. So he wasn't inaccessible. It wasn't this like, just purely intellectual exercise to get citations or to like grow your own career, or like it wasn't any of these things we might criticize modern academia for. But I think, as you say, it aims at something larger, especially the ancient Greek conception of philosophy aimed at something larger. Yeah, and he failed to make that. I mean, still was making this jump in one extent. He was in court. He was influencing people. He was existing outside of the ivory tower. But I guess the way that I want to frame this is like, is that project even possible? Do we have an example of that project even being successfully done? Like, is there the sophist reforming the tyrant? Does that even happen? It's not so much that Plato failed. It's not clear to me that Plato's failed, because I don't know if anybody's actually done this. You can come into a court and like navigate the court in a kind of Machiavellian realpolitik way, but I'm just not sure if anybody succeeded. And I would like to see that before I guess Plato's failed, because maybe it's just not possible.
Yeah, you can almost have. I think there's that question about whether you reform a tyrant, whether that's possible, and perhaps even the broader question about the role of politics in a philosopher's life. And you can almost read this story in two ways. Plato was, not just the man of theory, but also the man of practice, and aimed to, dive into political court when, doing so was rational, and he thought he could, have a possible impact, and at least it was good for relationships with Dion and so on. I think that's another factor. But you could also read this in almost as a story about what happens, what goes wrong when the philosopher tries to enter political life, and have almost a more monastic argument, which is that philosophy ought to be focused on describing the world accurately, and this is a sort of a warning of what happens when philosophers bumble their way into court politics. And wouldn't the world be a better place if Plato had written another dialogue or two instead of
Yeah.
going over to Syracuse or something like this? So
Yeah, kind of like
there's that
stay in
tension.
your lane. Like, yeah, Plato's has value to add. It's not this, and yeah, you could have written some more instead of spending some years of your later life doing this.
Yeah. I'm not sure if that's right, but I think there's at least those two frames on
It is a sad reading, but it is something to it. Anything else to add, or any last thoughts on Waterfield's book?
No, that's all. I mean, it's a bit daunting. It's very daunting to write a biography on Plato, and also a challenge to review a biography of Plato, just because he is such a important figure to philosophy and the Western culture and such. So, and I think anyone who wants to get a little bit more background on Athenian society broadly, Plato in particular, after poking around some of his dialogues, would be well served to look at Waterfield's book.
One last word I'll say on it. I mean, it makes me think about this kind of. I think it's a great way to have this combination of somebody who's so well versed in the philosophy. Like, Waterfield does know what he's talking about. I'm not a Plato expert, but I know enough Plato to say, like, he does know what he's talking about philosophically, and so to combine that with the biographical aspects was really valuable. And then it was very readable. Like, it was not. It's very readable, not overly complicated or obscure or complex where it doesn't need to be, which is much appreciated. It's the kind of thing. It's actually a really easy read for the subject matter. So, yeah, really enjoyed it and got what I wanted out of it, which is to, like, understand Plato, I think, better as a person and have a bit of a better sense of what directed his thinking. Again, that dynamic of just to close the loop on that, tyranny versus democracy both fail. How can we do it better? Well, we can do it through this philosopher king model, but what value is that if it's not practical? And then this later period where he tries to make it practical and tries to explore the possibility of doing that, which is a compelling way, not the only way to read Plato and think about Plato, but a compelling way to think about some of the ideas that unify his work.
Awesome. Thanks, Michael.
Thanks, Gil.